presentation now, so let's get going. So firstly, I'd obviously like to thank the sponsors and partners who've made this all possible. As ever, these events cost time and money to make them happen, and they're not possible without that. It's not quite the same expense as hiring a venue, but people have given up their time to make these things happen. People have given up their money. So thank you to the community organizers for making all this happen. So without people giving up their time, none of this stuff would happen. So we all owe them a debt of gratitude. So moving on a little bit, the obligatory slide about the raffle and all the action going on in the bar. So there's the shameless promotion for that. So I'm sure you've seen this slide already, but I'll keep going. Right, now we actually get to the presentation. You can see a quick QR code on there. If you can't be bothered to type all those things, you can zap the QR code and it should take you to my blog page where you can find out the details. My name is Dylan Hayes. I work for a company based in the UK called Blacklight Software. My job is I am a consultant on all things Microsoft 365. I came from a background in development, and over the last few years, I've joined the dark side, I guess you could say, where now I spend my time working on much more customer focused stuff in front of customers. So I've joined the dark side, having gone through the world of being a developer and gradually finding myself spending more and more time in front of customers. And now I pretty much spend my days talking to customers in pre-sales and stuff like that. So I've definitely joined the dark side, I'm afraid. Prior to that, I had an interesting career prior to becoming a developer. I worked in the oil industry, which involved me getting sent to various exotic places all over the world, in jungles and deserts and oceans. And somehow I became a software developer. Somehow I got into software development from there. It's a kind of strange story of how I was sat very, very bored with a computer. And I was thinking, well, let's do something with this computer. And so I started to develop, and the rest is history. Anyway, so that's how I came from a degree in geology to development and then eventually consultancy. So like I said before, you can zap the QR code. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm quite active on Twitter. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well. So I would welcome to continue the conversation. If there's anything you see here that interests you, do feel free to contact me and I'll be happy to answer any questions that are too hard to be answered now, or just if you want to chat about anything. We all need to support each other these days in terms of our own mental health, in terms of our own career development, in terms of just networking and stuff like that. So please do connect with me on LinkedIn and follow me on Twitter, and I promise I'll do the same back to you. So here's a little agenda about what we're going to be talking about. First thing, I always like to start with a why. There's no point doing something unless you have an objective. Why are we going to do this? We're going to talk a little bit about the document life cycle, some scenarios, then how it works in Microsoft 365. We're going to have a couple of demos, if the demo gods are smiling upon us today, including event-based retention, which is quite an interesting concept actually, but just not quite fleshed out yet. Then we'll have a sum up and questions. Now, if anybody does have a question in the meantime, I think we've got plenty of time, so stick your hand up or come off mute and ask me. So I'd welcome the questions. We're not so tight on time that we can't stop for a question. If it's a complicated question, we can come back to afterwards. But I think for the purposes of this, if you have a quick question, please stop me, raise your hand, or just butt in and say, hey, can you explain what you mean there? When your bullshit detector goes off, please feel free to ask. So, getting started, what is a memory hole and why did I choose the word memory hole? Well, interestingly enough, memory hole gets used nowadays as an expression to mean to dump something into the ether, to send it away to nowhere. But the actual expression came from a novel that's a very famous novel by an English author called George Orwell, the novel being 1984. And the interesting thing about in this novel, it featured somebody whose job it was to work for a government minister, and his job fundamentally was to destroy history. His job was to find records of the past which disagreed with the recordings of what people wanted to say now and destroy them. In the story, as you can see on the screen, in the quote on screen, effectively documents would be burnt. This was in the days before they discovered shredders. Documents would be destroyed all the time just so that there was no record of the past. Now, obviously, what we're going to be talking about is not as sinister as this, but I thought it was an interesting thing to compare how the idea of destroying information because it was no longer suitable or useful or what you wanted to say is not a new idea. It's just nowadays we have the technology to do this. So let's get started into what do we mean by this. So we all forget things. I forget things all the time, particularly when it comes to going to the supermarket and buying things. Suddenly I find myself unable to remember the most simple of things. Obviously, there's technological solutions to remembering things. We have things like To Do, which I'm a great believer in, pieces of paper, and obviously Microsoft 365 fundamentally exists to help us remember things, or at least it gives an organization some form of memory. So that begs the question, if information is the new oil and that we can gather all this information so easily and we can store this information so easily, why shouldn't we just say, let's keep everything forever? Because why not? The information might be useful. If this is the new oil, then why not hoard this stuff? Information is power, surely. So why don't we hoard everything? Well, what we're going to do is go into some of the reasons why you might need to forget things, and also some of the reasons you might retain things. If you remember, part of the reason for this talk, it isn't just about destroying information, it's also about times in which you may want to keep information. So it's not simple, it's not as simple as shredding things. There has to be the period of time when you keep something before that information is destroyed. Anybody got any questions so far? Are we all happy so far? Right, let's just start going into the slides in more detail now. So let's talk about the reasons why we should forget things. Now, when we're talking about things we should forget, I'm not talking about horrendous first dates or embarrassing teenage moments. I'm talking about why organizations, corporations and things should forget things. Well, the very obvious thing is that storage is not infinite. We keep getting more and more storage lobbed at us, and capacities of drives and things rise all the time. So clearly we are able to store far more information today than we were able to store 10 years ago, or even think about 100 years ago, how difficult it was to store information and to be able to pull it back. Those of you that are older might remember in times gone past, before things were electronically stored, we actually copied documents onto microfilm, and we had microfilm viewers to store things. Now, clearly we've gone beyond that, that it's very, very easy to store information. So if storage is like that, why shouldn't we just store everything? Well, whatever you do, no matter how hard you try, information there'll always be more information than you have storage. Just inevitably you will run through all the storage in your tenant if you try and keep everything. Now, the other point is that it's what I call the fog of data. If you store everything, you've stored things that are irrelevant. You might be storing things that are no longer correct. You might be storing a policy document which is no longer correct, which no longer correctly reflects the views of the organization. So effectively, the real information you want, the correct and true information, can sometimes become obscured by this fog of data. So I see that sometimes, in order to clear the fog of data, you need to forget things, you need to remove information. That's quite important. So there's one version of the truth. If you have multiple versions of the truth, say several different versions of a policy document, and that policy document's quite important, this could be embarrassing because somebody might find the wrong version of it. I know we have things in SharePoint like version control and things that can help us, but sometimes for various reasons you'll have outdated information, and that information is potentially dangerous, or at least at the very least that information is not useful to you. Now, the other reason we should forget is that regulation says that you have the right to be forgotten. GDPR obviously is a huge thing across the whole of Europe and the UK, as we are now set on our own course, but GDPR will still apply in the UK for the foreseeable future. So GDPR says that you should only keep information that you have a legitimate reason to have, and you should only keep it for as long as you need it. Now, there's a lot of work required to quantify exactly how long and what those things are, but clearly what GDPR is saying is you can't keep everything forever if that information is about a person. People have the right to have their information treated as a precious commodity. We mentioned before, data is the new oil. So if the data is about you, GDPR establishes that you have some rights towards that data and how it's treated and how it's handled. So regulation is another reason why we may need to forget. The other interesting point, and this is possibly more relevant to Americans than it is to Europeans. Obviously, they don't have GDPR, so the regulation aspect is less important, although California is introducing something very, very similar to GDPR. But Americans are notorious for suing each other at the drop of a hat. The slightest thing happens and everybody sues everybody else. Now, the interesting thing is that all the data you have, if you're not legally obliged to keep it, some of that data may actually be a liability to your organization. So if you have an email that in that email you said a certain thing, and that piece of information is potentially evidence that could be used against you. When I say you, I mean the organization you work for. So potentially every piece of information you keep that you don't need is potentially something that is a weapon that can be used against you if you get into complicated lawsuits and things like that. If you think about some of the lawsuits that have involved patents, one of the things that happens is they have a huge process of discovery where people dig through all these documents and they try and establish who said what at various times over many, many years. So this is a very, very complicated area where people can pore over it, but some of those pieces of information could be damaging to your organization. So the simple answer is, if you don't need it, and you're not legally obliged to keep it, then why not get rid of it? Because then it's not a weapon that can be used against you. And lastly, speaking of weapons that can be used against you, we need to think about security. Unfortunately, the possibility of being breached is very much a fact of life. We can do all we can to avoid being breached, but ransomware, inside threats, all sorts of other things mean that inevitably some of our data will spill to the outside world, or it will end up in the hands of people who mean us ill. And we have certain legal obligations about if we have a breach that we have to inform people. We may be legally liable for things. It could be an extremely expensive mistake. Well, if you don't have that information, you can't lose it. If the information's gone, nobody can steal it. So you think, well, how would this apply to me? But interestingly enough, I think of a case I know where a customer had documents that detailed passwords for very old systems, and they'd kept that data because they hadn't thought about getting rid of it. Now, having a password that's 10 years old to a system that no longer exists, you think, what's the harm in that? Well, the unfortunate thing is humans are fundamentally very lazy. And if you've dreamed up a very, very clever password, even 10 years ago, the chances are that somebody will still be using that password currently. So things like even old passwords or things you think have no informational value whatsoever may actually be valuable in the hands of somebody else. Again, things like invoices that you don't need to keep, it establishes a relationship with a supplier. And if you're going to have some very, very complicated attacks where people are using spear phishing to find their way into a company, any piece of information about how your organization works, even if it's old and not something you need right away, may be useful in the hands of your enemies. So in essence, don't keep things that you don't think you need anymore, because they could be weapons against you. So that's the reasons why we should forget. And obviously I've just talked to you at great length about why we should forget things. And the next thing to think about is why we should remember. Obviously, we have to balance these two things. So why would we, excuse me a moment, I just need to take a drink of water. Why would we remember? Well, as I said before, storage is cheap and it's only going to get cheaper. Every so often, Microsoft are very generous to us and they bump up the amount of storage you get on your tenant. Last time that happened was 2 years ago. I guess we might be due for one of those in the future because we keep generating more data. And the price of storage is falling, so we may be getting more data. So you think, why worry about it? Because storage is cheap and it's only going to get cheaper. Why not just store stuff? We just need to store stuff. And in response to the idea of this fog of data, well, you think, well, search is fast nowadays. Search used to be terrible in SharePoint, but search now is really, really rather good. And obviously Project Cortex is going to yield things where we can search through unstructured data so much better than we used to. Things like syntax, and things will allow us to search for data. So maybe it's not so important that we've stored huge amounts of unstructured data, because the tools are smart enough now to allow us to find that data. So if search is getting better and faster, so what if you store more than you need? So what if you overstore? You've got the tools there to be able to dig into that data. And obviously a very important thing that we shouldn't overlook is that industry and government regulations require you to store data. Obviously certain rules in certain sectors, the medical industry and banking have very, very strict rules about what you have to store. You have a strong legal obligation that you absolutely have to store certain data, and you absolutely have to store it for a long time. So that data is very, very important. So you can't just delete that. You may actually be breaking the law if you delete that data. You're certainly opening yourself up for problems later on. The other reason you might want to store data is that it audits what happens. A customer of ours was talking about a scenario where they wish to store for a very, very long time the records of people on a construction site being issued with the correct personal protective equipment. I'm talking about things like ear defenders, steel toe cap boots, and face shields so that you couldn't get things in your eye. And they needed to have records of that going back a long time, because potentially somebody 20 years from now could sue that organization to say that you failed to provide me with the right equipment to work in a dangerous environment, and as a consequence I've gone deaf, or I've got some horrible disease in my lungs because I didn't have the right equipment to protect my lungs from this. So there's a lot to be said for storing information that may have some impact in future, that it proves you did things in the right way. The other area is perhaps security. In terms of security, having an audit log of what happened to documents and things like that, an audit log of various interactions may help if there's some sort of problem later on you want to establish, whether there was a security breach or fraud within the organization or something like that. So audit purposes are a very good reason why you'd want to keep information. And lastly, the reverse of the point I made about how you can't lose what you haven't got is, once it's gone, it's gone. If you have deleted the information and you don't back up your Office 365 tenant, which a lot of people don't do, how do you get that information back? It's gone, it's really gone. And once it's gone through the 93 days and it has been disposed of, there is no coming back from it. You really have, that data is lost forever unless it exists in your head. Any questions so far? Okay, let's move on a little bit. So, as I said before, that there is a whole load of reasons why you would want to keep some data, and there's a whole load of reasons why you wouldn't want to keep some data. So what I've tried to do is sum this up into a little chart that tries to balance the two things. And in a lot of things, this is very much me talking like a consultant, where I say it depends all the time. There is no right answer. It's just you have to balance conflicting arguments. Like regulation, there's a reason to keep it would be industry regulations, and the reason you delete it is GDPR. Security, you have audit history as a good reason to keep stuff, but again, you can't lose what you don't have. Knowledge is power, more data to analyze. Of course, if you keep everything, you've got more data, you might be able to draw better conclusions from having a bigger data set, especially now we can set machine learning on these things. And the counter argument to that is, well, you're just going to be lost in this fog of data and you can never find the right piece of information. So instead of one document in 10,000, you're looking for one document in 10 million. That's so much harder. Storage is cheap, but storage is finite, so you need to balance between those. And lastly, we talked about the legal aspects of that. On the one side, you have a legal obligation to keep things, and on the other side, information you keep is potentially weaponized against you. So you have to balance between those two things, where those sit. Now, the interesting thing is I keep referring to we, and obviously it's not a decision that you are going to make as a lowly IT person. These definitely are not your decisions. These are decisions that need to be made by stakeholders and quite senior stakeholders elsewhere in the organization to decide which way these things are, which is where we're coming to next. So if I just move on again, little interesting aside for you here. What you can see on screen is one of the oldest documents in the world. I believe that document is something crazy like I think it's 5,000 years old or whatever, and it's a record of taxes that somebody's paid. So it just goes to show that retention is pretty serious, because in this case, this document's lasted for over 5,000 years. A famous dead taxpayer once said, "Nothing is certain in life apart from death and taxes." And here you can see an example how the records of somebody's tax has lived on far beyond their lifespan. It's quite a fascinating idea that we're talking about how to destroy information that we don't need after a few weeks. And here you have some piece of information that's been kicking around since the sort of ancient Egyptian times. In fact, I think this is Sumerian, so this is just seriously old stuff. So it's an interesting aside to think about all this information we're creating. We're creating information at colossal volumes. In the last 20 years, I think every 18 months, we're doubling the amount of information we're producing, and we've got to do something to save us from being swamped in this data. But sometimes information sticks around for a very, very, very long time. Obviously, there's no retention policy relating to clay documents. Some of these must have got destroyed accidentally. Some of these may have stuck around, but sometimes information lingers on. So it's an interesting thing to think about. We're obviously doing this in a much more controlled way, but information does stick around. So we talked about how information sometimes needs to be kept and how information needs to be destroyed. Well, the chances are that both of those statements apply to a document, just at different points in its life cycle. So typically, a document may go through a process where it's initially created. It may be edited, which obviously SharePoint is a great platform for editing it because you can collaborate and bring other people. So at some point, the document springs into being, having been edited, and it is now useful. So it has its lifespan where it needs to be stored. So we've all worked on this document, and you say, okay, this document records a certain set of facts and it needs to be stored for a certain amount of time. And then at some point it needs to be deleted, or maybe it needs to be thought about whether it's deleted. So fundamentally, all documents go through this life cycle, but there will be slight variations on it. Now, what we're going to do now is look at some of the use cases we'd have for why documents have this life cycle. So just moving on to the next slide. It's a slight complexity to this, as I mentioned before. Sometimes when you store a document, do you retain it, as in do you prevent it being deleted, or you just say at this point, well, we can delete it if you want to, but you don't have to. And again, with delete it, do you actually want to delete it at a certain point, or you just say this is now okay to delete? So there's a certain amount of optionalness in this, but fundamentally all documents go through a very similar process of create, used, and destroyed. So let's talk about some possible variations, which I've just touched on there before. So you might have a document that you create, keep it for a certain amount of time, so say 6 years, and then you delete. You may create something, keep it for a certain amount of time, say a month or something like this, and then you flag it for deletion. So you say to people, this document has exceeded the time we normally keep a document for. Do you want to get rid of this document? So you may choose to store. There may be a good reason to store it. So things like case studies and things like that, you may want to store them for a certain amount of time, and then you may choose to get rid of them. And then we get onto a slightly more complicated scenario where you keep something, an event happens, and then some time elapses, and then you can delete. And then finally, you can have something very similar where you keep something for a long time, something happens, time elapses, and then you can say it's flagged for deletion. In other words, you could choose to get rid of this. So rapidly, you can start seeing from a very, very simple life cycle, we're building out into steadily more complicated ways of deciding on the document life cycle. So let's talk about some examples, because all this stuff so far, we've talked about this being very, very airy-fairy. Now, what I've done is I've gone around and I've looked at some policies that different customers have insisted that apply. Now, these policies will be set by people from the legal team. These people will be set by people from HR in consultation with the legal team. So these are rules that apply. You may find in your country the rules are slightly different. Some of these will be based on GDPR or based on local legislation or even just company policy. But a typical example of some of these things is an interview record for an unsuccessful candidate should be kept for 2 months and deleted. So in other words, if you apply for a job and unfortunately you're unsuccessful, the company has to delete that after 2 months because GDPR says you no longer have a need to keep that piece of information, and that is personal information that belongs to somebody, and that's generally accepted that it should be vaporized at that time. And another interesting one, and this is a slight variation of that, employee records should be kept for 6 years after termination of employment. Now, you notice this is slightly different. Before we talked about you have your interview and we keep it for 2 months. In the case of an employee record, like say your records of your salary, your appraisals and things like that, you can keep them for no longer than 6 years. So after you leave the company, a 6-year clock starts, at which point those documents need to be got rid of. And now we start getting into much more complicated rules. Records about children should be kept until the young person reaches 21 years old. So this is quite a complicated scenario because the amount of time you keep that will obviously depend on the age of the child at that time. So this is an event that happens outside. So a person reaching 21 years. I work in scouting and we have records that we have to keep about young people. And it's tricky because obviously GDPR is particularly protective of the records of children. So it's a constant source of problems. So this is an example of some of the rules that should apply. Like you can keep the records about a child until a certain point they reach 21 years old, at which point you're considered that there's a reset and that information can go. The other thing is sometimes, as I mentioned before, for litigation purposes or something like that, you may wish to keep medical records for a long, long time, because with occupational health, where somebody's working with hazardous substances and things like that, and radiation and all sorts of other horrible things, you need to keep that information for a very, very long time, because later on that person may have health problems and you need to have those records. If you've just deleted those records because the person has left the company, or if you delete them after 6 months, then you've failed in your duty of care to be able to produce that information. So what you can see there, there's a lot of very complicated scenarios here. And as I said before, these aren't things we make up. This is information that needs to come from somebody else within the organization, and they're going to be the people that say, these are the rules that we'd like to apply to our information that you hold. So I'd like to say, before we actually start, so if you're actually going to embark on this, this is serious shit, because if you get this wrong, you can destroy people's lives because you may not retain the records. It could potentially destroy people's health because you've not stored information. It can certainly be damaging to your career if you make a big mess of this, and it can certainly be damaging to the profitability of the organization you can work for. This is not trivial data, which makes this particularly hard. And as I said before, you've got to have buy-in from the stakeholders about how they set the rules. Now, what may actually happen with your stakeholders is different stakeholders within the organization may have contradictory desires. One part of the organization might want to say that we want to keep this stuff forever, because they see the information as being valuable. Another part of the organization may say about the same data, hey, no, this information is personally identifiable information. We need to get rid of this after a certain amount of time. So it's quite possible that you may have slightly contradictory requirements, and you need to try and work out somebody who tells you this is what we need to do. So it's not always as simple, because some documents may refer to things that touch many parts of the organization. So a lot of information related to human resources issues may actually go outside of human resources, because they deal with payroll, or they may deal with appraisals, they may deal with all sorts of things. So it's serious stuff, and you need to make sure you get buy-in from the right stakeholders to describe this stuff properly for you. Now, you can't do everything at once, but you do need to get the rules right on a particular area before you start doing this thing. I've noticed I've just spelt retention wrong there. I do apologize. This stuff is serious, and so you really need to know the rules before you start, because it's much, much harder to change the rules after you've started. So if, for example, you're going to set up retention in the human resources area, you need to think about this stuff before you start. So having talked at great length about the concept before, we've spent literally half an hour talking about all the reasons why. Let's actually start seeing how this manifests itself into Microsoft 365. Now, Microsoft are very fond of the word policy. In fact, I would say policy is nearly as popular a word as Teams. Teams is possibly the most popular word in Microsoft 365. It just turns up everywhere in so many different contexts, but policy is nearly as popular. So I'm going to say policy here and label, and both of them have slightly different meanings at different times. So we have retention policies and retention labels. You'll hear policy in another context at the moment and label in another context at the moment, but we have retention policies and retention labels, and they define behavior, which is then automatic. The idea being that if you apply a retention policy or label to an item, once that's applied, the rest is taken care of for you. That's the beauty of this, is once that's done, the back-end processes will handle all this for you, so there's nothing more to be done. Effectively, you label the item correctly, and as long as the label is the correct label or it's in the right area, everything else happens automatically. That's the beauty of this. There's nothing to remember to come back to later. The slight difference is a retention policy applies to everything in a location. So for example, you might say everything in the HR onboarding site has this policy applied to it, this retention policy applied to it. A label is slightly different in the sense the label applies to an individual item and they're sticky. So again, this can apply all over your tenant. It can apply to SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, Microsoft 365 groups, pardon me, and Yammer. So let's drill into these in a bit more detail. I would say that a retention policy is painting with a spray can. They've been around for a long time, so they're the first version of doing this. And so they're a little less flexible. There's a few less features in there, but they're quite good in the sense of you wanting to get some simple rules set up. They're applied to a specific area in Microsoft 365, so something like a site or a particular area in Exchange or something, but there are certain limitations in how you can mix and match these things. So they have certain inherent limitations. I'm not going to go into that in huge detail at this point because it's pointless and it'll probably change, but they typically apply to an area and they have certain limitations. And the confusing thing is we'll also see the word label policy later on. As I said before, Microsoft love the word policy, so policy comes up everywhere. So in your head, you need to think about this being a retention policy, and it'll be labeled slightly differently in the user interface in different places. Label policy is not the same as retention policy. Just remember that. So retention labels, I would see that retention labels are fundamentally like painting things with a fine artist brush. As I said before, Microsoft love to reuse a term. So we have retention labels, which is different to a sensitivity label. A sensitivity label is something we'll come to somewhere else in the outer scope of this, but it's a way of saying how secret the data is and dictating certain rules, which is obviously quite related, but they are not the same. So both of them are labels. So when somebody refers to a label within Microsoft 365, it could mean either a retention label or a sensitivity label. It applies to an item and it's sticky. By sticky, I mean that if you move a document from Exchange, for example, to Teams and then into Yammer and then into OneDrive and then eventually into SharePoint, its label will stick with it all the way. Now, the label doesn't follow it outside, which is one difference with a sensitivity label. Sensitivity labels are burned into the document itself with DRM. These aren't, but they are sticky in the sense a label will, once a label's stuck, it'll follow it around. Now, who can apply labels? A user can apply a label if those labels have been published, or they can be applied by rules based on where it is or some content. And you can even have trainable classifiers that, for example, might look for information that's PII, say it contains bank account details, and then applies a certain retention label to it. As I said before, we like the word policy, so retention labels have a label policy, which is different to a retention policy. It's confused me every time I think about it as well. When you see it in the interface, it's slightly easier, but after a while, your head starts swimming with these things. Let's talk about good habits before we actually get down to the user interface part of it. These are some lessons I've learned the hard way from making mistakes. You'll actually see in my demo in a minute some of the mistakes I've made. I would say that your names should reflect the content, not the timings. So, for example, if you have a policy that applies to employee appraisals, you should say employee appraisals, not keep for 6 years or keep for 10 years. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the law might change and you might find that you have to keep employee appraisals for 7 years rather than 6. And so your policy or your label that's called keep for 6 years is suddenly wrong in a material sense. So it really should be descriptive of what the thing you are protecting is rather than what the time frame is, because those can change. And the other thing is I would suggest that you need to be fine-grained in there. As I said before, it would be nice to create a label for employee appraisals rather than having a very generic one of keep for 6 years, because you might find you put other documents into the 6-year label because you think, well, they're also needing to be kept for 6 years. And then it turns out that there's a change in policy and one thing has to be kept for 6 years and the other has to be kept for 7 years, but they're both sharing the same label. So you created extra work for yourself. So ideally, you should be quite fine-grained about these so that you're describing the things. So if the rules change, which they quite possibly will, then you haven't given yourself a whole load of extra work of trying to separate those things out. So like I said before, careful naming is the key to sanity, because you are going to be dealing with these things for a long time. If documents can be stored for 7 years, you're pushing a problem onto your future self to understand what the heck you were thinking about 6 years ago. It's tough. I find I struggle to remember things I did 2 weeks ago. So the idea that somebody, potentially not yourself, having to try and figure these things out when they've got poorly named conventions afterwards is just storing up trouble for somebody. So what we're going to do now is we're going to spring into having a look at the admin side of the tool. So I'm just going to spring over. So let me just pick the right. So what we're going to have now is we are in our compliance center. So if we click into policies, we can walk in down here. So you will find there is an area of Microsoft 365 admin where the compliance stuff is, and you will find in here policies. We do love the word policies and we keep using it, and you will find here you can see your policies for retention. So if we snap into here, this is a tenant I've got set up with some demos, and you can see here I've created some retention policies. Confusingly in the interface, we've decided to call these retention. These are actually retention policies. But it just says retention. As I said, these namings here can be maddening at a time. So what we've got here is these are some retention policies I've created. Now, you remember I told you not to use names of the time period that you're going to keep things. Well, guess what? I've used those names and it's a dumb idea. You can see here, this is my earlier attempt. This was in January, and you can see that I've called something retained for 10 years, which was a dumb policy. I would say don't follow my example. And you can see more recent things I've set up where I've used more descriptive names. I've described something about where it is and a little bit about it. So there you can see some good examples of policies and some bad examples of policy names. So we can drill into one of these. And you can see, let's take a look at the anatomy of this. Now, the interesting thing is we can actually create a policy, but it takes a while to stick. So if I was to actually create a policy now, which we can do, unfortunately, I couldn't show you that in the user side because it usually takes a couple of hours up to a day to apply and be available. So you're going to have to work with me on this and just pretend that time is elapsed. So we're going to do what they always do on these cookery programs where they pull one out of the oven and say, here's one we've prepared earlier. So here's our retention policy. You see, now we've gone back to calling it a policy. Before we just called it retention. So I've called this one destroy after 7 days. You will notice I can't change the name. So you've got to get that name right, because that name, you are stuck with that name forever. So this is where it applies, because we can apply it across the whole of our tenant in different ways. We can apply this to Exchange, we can apply it to SharePoint, we can apply it to OneDrive and Office 365 groups. Now, Yammer's not mentioned in there, but I believe Yammer is part of the party now and can play. But you can apply, as you can see, this is across the whole of the tenant in different ways. These are very, very powerful because you can apply this to email as well as just documents within SharePoint. Now we talk about the settings. So if you see here, what we've just said is retain items for a specific period. So we've said we're going to keep this item for 7 years. Now you can set it up with all sorts of other things. You could go in there if you wanted to, and you could put 99 years. Now it's kind of weird to think about 99 years from now and Microsoft 365 and what they'll be calling it at that point. But there we go. You could actually create a policy that will probably outlive you. And then you can say how it started, so based on certain rules, when the item was created or when the item was last modified. So obviously we're trying to describe this thing. And then we're saying at the end of the retention period, you can say delete it automatically, do nothing. You can do various things. As I said, I've started because I'm editing one I've already created. I can't fundamentally change this, but you can see some of the settings. You've got various options to decide what happens. And then it's confirming all those things you know here, and it's telling me that anything older than 99 years will be deleted after you turn on this policy. Well, my tenant certainly hasn't been around for 99 years, so I think I can hit submit on this one. So it means that if this destroy after 7 days, I've really not created a very well-named policy there, have I? So the policy is called destroy after 7 days, but I'm actually going to keep it for 99 years. So that just shows the fallacy of naming your policy after the retention period. And there we go, it's in there. So anything that's tagged with this will now be zapped. So let's just come back to where we were before. I'm just going to rewind into here again. We talked about retention. This was the retention policies. Now we're going to talk about labels. There's a whole bunch of labels I've created here. And you can see that I do learn from my mistakes, and recently I've been creating ones with more suitable names. Like I've created one called Employee Service Records, which is kept for 6 years. I've got Employee Occupational Health, which is 40 years. This is a test tenant of mine, and I've created something I'll show you later, that I've created something with a retention period of 1 day. And you can see my earlier rubbish attempts at this, where I've said things like retain for 10 years, and then I've got something else that says retain forever. So we've got various labels. Now what happens is a label then gets published. So if I choose some of these labels at the moment are just sitting there ready to be used. What you have to do is publish them. So if you can see here, there are label policies where I've created a whole bunch of policies and I'm going to publish them. I can target this at a different area. We'll just walk through this very, very quickly. So if I just say I'm going to publish these things here, I'm going to publish this, and I'm going to publish this. And I'm going to say publish labels. By publishing, effectively, you're bundling up a collection of labels and putting them in a package, and you can say where it's going to go. So I'm going to say this could go everywhere, or I could choose this goes to just a very specific site. So I could say within SharePoint that it just goes to one particular site whose name I haven't got there. So the idea is you can micro target this, or you could choose to be all sites. So the idea is that if you have collections of different labels, you can say that these ones here, you'd only like to publish them to the HR site. These ones here need to go to a health and safety site. These ideas that a policy is a series of different labels. Now, because policy, the word policy is used so many times, it's extremely confusing to get your head around, but the idea is actually quite decent. So I'm not going to go all the way through with creating this. So the idea is you can manage your policies here. As I said, these are some examples where I've published these before. I've bundled up various policies and I've said I've published these to a certain place. So I've said this particular retention policy just applies to a certain place within SharePoint. You can see that I've published it to just one site. So the idea is I can create a bundle of these things, call it a retention policy, and push it to somewhere else. So we're just going to come out of here now. You can also import and export this stuff so you can move it between tenants. I'm not going to get too bogged down in this. So now we're actually going to see these things used in anger. So I've got here in my demo tenant, I've got some documents here and I'd like to apply some policies. It's really that simple. So here's our document again. I should hasten to add that I use a fictitious supervillain as my SharePoint demo tenant. So I'm not actually in the business of being an evil person who takes over the world. It's just I like to have fun, and this is how I publish it. So I've got my item here. So if you can see here, it says apply apply retention label. And these are the labels I've got here. So I've got one called 7 days, which, as I said before, is a terrible name and you shouldn't use names like this. And I've got another one for 10 years and it does. So I can apply those two. And if you remember, I've just changed 7 days. So it actually keeps it for 99 days. So this is a really terrible choice of label, but I'm going to apply it anyway. So there I go. I've applied that label here. And I'm going to apply this label here to this other item here. So we say, whoopee-doo, I'm a site collection admin. I should be able to do everything I like to here. So let's just try and delete this item. Actually, I can. Whoops, I guess this label, the demo gods are not smiling on me there. I shouldn't be able to delete that. I must be on somewhere else where I haven't. Do apologize. I had all this set up in the correct place. And it should demonstrate me not being able to delete. I believe these things are actually, I believe the policies there that I've published say it needs to be deleted after a certain time, but I'm not forcing it to be retained. So that is my mistake. I should have prepared. I've got somewhere else where I've actually got the policy that stops you deleting. So in this particular case, because my policy says you can delete this, it'll just automatically delete. I can actually. I just deleted that document. So there I've demonstrated that this automatically deletes after a certain time, but it doesn't stop you deleting. So I do apologize. The demo gods weren't kind to me there because I made a mistake in my demo. Now, the other interesting thing you can do in the time we've got available is you can have event-based you can have some event-based things. And the idea is that if somebody leaves the company, you can set a timer going and you can basically say after a certain amount of time, delete these documents. I'm going to show you a demo of this and hopefully the demo gods will be smiling to me. So here I have a series of fictitious Marvel supervillains. And I would like to apply some policies to those. So in my fictitious world, if you are an evil supervillain and you die, I'd like to delete your membership documents after a certain amount of time is elapsed. So how we do this here is it works slightly differently. So if you can see here, I can apply a retention label and I have various other retention labels here that I've published. And I've got one here called Supervillain Membership Publishing Supervillain Club membership document. So I'm going to apply this here and it's asking me for an asset ID here. So I'm going to just put in an asset ID. Now, what does this asset ID mean? This asset ID means that if I was to subsequently come along and create an event, I can say that everything that's tagged with that asset ID then gets vaporized. So here we have Thanos's membership pack. So I'm just going to come in here. I've created this document. I'm going to apply a retention label and I'm going to give it an asset ID of Thanos. So this identifies this. And now we'll step back into the admin part and I'll show you how this bit works under the scenes. So if we just come, if we just come back into records management, actually, we have a retention policy here. One moment. So what I've done is I've set up a policy here that's slightly different. And what I've said is this policy has an event associated with it. And it means that it will delete after a certain amount of time when an event happens. So I've just, as a user, I've set up these things. And what I'd like to do is create an event now to say that Thanos has died. So let's go and delete his documents after a certain amount of time. So if I flick over to another screen, I will find in records management, annoyingly, this stuff exists in several different places. We have label policies and we have events. So what happens now is I'm going to create an event and I've created one before. So I'm going to demonstrate how this works. We're going to create a new event. So this is me declaring an event. So I'm going to say that Red Skull has died. So we're going to create an event. So Red Skull died. It's a friendly description. You don't want dead or red. We're going to go through to the next bit here and we're going to say what event type is this? And I've defined a custom event before here called a supervillain death. So this event is bound to a retention policy. So I'm going to effectively create this event and we're just going to review our settings and event settings here. So which asset ID, if you remember, I tagged these things with a asset. So it's saying which asset are we actually going to affect this to. So I'm going to say that this applies to the asset ID we tagged with earlier and create this event. And what's happened now is I've created an event. So after 1 day, as my policy dictates, Thanos's documents will be deleted. Now, it's quite an interesting thing. As you can see, the creating an event is a real pain. It wouldn't scale. It's just something you're not going to be able to do. Now, the nice thing is that you can do this with PowerShell, or it has a REST API. So you could potentially set up something in Power Automate. So some other process triggers this, it makes an API call and it sets off these events. So in other words, when an employee leaves the organization, it creates that event and it starts the timer ticking on getting rid of those documents. Once that time is ticking, in 6 years' time, the file's going to vaporize and no further effort is required. But it's a nice idea. There's a certain amount of work to get it to work, but it's pretty good. So I think that's it for my demo. So I'm just going to skip back to my main deck. So here we go there. So user demo, we've done that, we've done that. So now we reached the summary part. So what we've learned so far is why we would do this. We've gone into quite a lot of detail about why, the pros and cons, about why you want to store things, why you want to do this. And we talked about why this is important to get it right, because you can mess up other people's lives in your own career if you get this wrong. So we've seen a little bit how it works, how the admin side works, the user side works. And you can see that this stuff gets really, really complicated after a while. So hopefully you've gained something from there. I'm sorry, it's a boring subject if we're going to be honest, but it's an essential subject to make things work. And hopefully I've given you some insight into it. This stuff takes a while to learn. What I would say is before you use any of this in anger, do this on a demo tenant. Do not do this on a live tenant until you're sure it works, because this stuff is dangerous. If you get this stuff wrong, then potentially you're going to delete a whole load of data and you're going to find yourself looking for another job, or possibly having to flee the country under an assumed identity, or all three of those. So the interesting thing about this, it still feels wrong to me, the idea that we're deleting data. It's, to me, data is something to be retained and hoarded, and we're deleting data, and it just feels wrong. But we talked about the reasons why this is right. Now, it's an interesting thing moving forward and thinking about the future, that we're erasing all this history behind us, which is I'm slightly uncomfortable with, but I can see the need, because otherwise we're just going to drown in our own data. So that's it, really. So I'd like to just hand you over and say thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this fundamentally boring subject wasn't too boring for you and I brought some light to it. And I will hand you back to the host. And if anybody wants to zap the QR, they can get my details if you want to make contact with me. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of the evening. And I'll hand you back to our gracious host.